What do you think people in Lebanon will be thinking at the moment is going to happen over the course of this week?
So the first thing that I know they're thinking, because I'm in touch with lots of friends in Lebanon, is that they're horrified by what's happened. They're horrified by the deaths of innocent civilians on the Israeli side and on, of course, the Palestinian side. So that's their first reaction. The second reaction is fear. They are very worried that there is the potential for this to escalate, that there could be that conflagration that they all fear, with Israel and Hezbollah kicking off again across that border, which would have horrific consequences for so many civilians in the country.
In the same way that Hamas does not represent every Palestinian, Hezbollah does not represent every person living in Lebanon. But can you, using your expertise, just paint a picture of just the kind of support that Hezbollah would have for its cause?
So absolutely right. I mean, Hezbollah does not represent everyone in Lebanon. It's a minority group. It has a certain amount of power in the south of Lebanon, and particularly in the Lebanese Shia community. But that isn't universal among that community or in that region at all. There are many Palestinians in that area. There are many Lebanese in that area of very different faiths, different political views, and most of them want what the rest of us want. They want what the Israelis want. They want what the citizens of Gaza want. They want to send their kids to school and live normal lives. And they don't want to be caught up in a conflict between Hezbollah and Iran and Israel. And the reason I mention Iran is that Hezbollah does answer to that regime more than it answers to the Lebanese people.
What do you think I'll start that question again. What do you think the global community's appeal to Lebanon must be at the moment? As you've already said, there is a vulnerability there with Iran, but at a time when some kind of justice is being sought for what happened in Israel, that puts Lebanon in a very difficult position, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I think our message to Lebanon has to be, it's the same message that I tried to deploy when I was there as ambassador, that we back your independence from these conflicts of the region and beyond, and that we back your stability. We know that the Lebanese people have no interest in being sucked into this conflict and don't want to be part of this conflict. But we also know that the state is very weak in Lebanon. The army has come a long, long way in the last decade, but still has trouble controlling all of the territory. The Lebanese people have been hit by economic shocks. They've been hit by the port explosion. They've been hit by this political inertia. And so we have to show that solidarity for them and do everything we can to keep them out of the conflict. Now, the Americans sending 2 carrier groups to the region is a great deterrent. It's a great way of saying this should not escalate beyond. But we have to be hammering home that message to the regional countries, but also to Israel, that an escalation across the border, I always think it's quite a good argument when you're talking privately to Israel as a friend to basically say a good starting point is not to do what Iran wants you to do. And if Iran is slightly enjoying the idea of this regional escalation, of a conflict that reduces further the chances to normalize relations across the region, then it's a good thing to avoid.
So if you were having exactly that conversation with Israel at the moment, realistically, what would you expect their immediate response to be?
So if I was having that conversation, I would be unequivocal in my condemnation of Hamas terrorism against innocent civilians. Of course, you have to start with empathy and solidarity for those civilians. But equally, unequivocal condemnation of any Israeli military action against civilians. You have to put international humanitarian law at the center of this. I don't want to live in a world run by the likes of Trump and Putin, where we just think that we can get away with ignoring international humanitarian law, or where we say that there is a separate international humanitarian law for Hezbollah, Hamas, and Israel, and one for the rest of us. So I think it has to start at that point, that we need to respect humanitarian law. I think I would also discourage any action, any escalation across that border, and say, it's not in the interests of Israel to escalate in that direction. It's certainly not in the interests of the Lebanese people, who very much don't want that. And then I'd be trying to get a conversation going on where does all this end? How do we work together to remove this threat of Hamas? How do we get these hostages back without making civilians pay the price for that? Where is the credible government going to emerge from in Gaza and in Lebanon when the dust settles? And for that, you need a partner on the other side. You need to build up the moderates on the other side. It's something that Bibi Netanyahu has always hated doing. But you do have to have an alternative to Hamas and to Hezbollah.
Sure. And of course, those are wise and tempered words, and they are being said by so many people at the moment, Tom. But realistically, when you listen to either Hamas or representatives of the Israeli government talk, the heat of the moment, the pain, the anger, the suffering that has been meted out or might be meted out on both sides is so visceral. That voice of reason, it just can't be heard. And I know that I speak for a lot of our listeners in expressing a frustration at that. What more can be done? Of course, the end game must be one of peace. But in this moment, that's not going to happen, is it?
It's very, very hard. And we have to understand that. People are emotional, they're raw, and as we would be if we'd suffered the terrorism that the Israelis have experienced at the hands of Hamas, or if we were suffering now life under the bombs as experienced by the Gazan civilian population. It's understandable that people feel angry and upset. And it's very, very difficult for diplomacy to thrive in that situation. But it can do. And you have to look for the helpers. You have to look for the humanity on the other side. I would always recommend avoiding this horrifically dehumanizing language that you hear often in conflicts like this. You have to try to understand that what most people want is what we want. They want to carry on living their lives in peace. You've got to try and carve out some genuine space, time, patience, courage to do that. It's not easy. But ultimately, you've got the three ways out of this are either that you just leave it to God to decide. You say, my God gave me the land and your God told you he gave the land, so let them decide. Or you fight it out, in which case the stronger side wins, in this case Israel, and the weaker side makes sure that they can't enjoy that and win and enjoy that period of peace. Or you find some way to compromise and work together and reach across the fence. And it's so hard to say that at this moment, and I don't underestimate that. But ultimately, that's where it's got to go.
Here's a big philosophical question for you, and one that you might not be able to answer. But do you think that actually for diplomacy, in your experience, to ever be a realistic thing, you need equivalence? And at the moment, there isn't an equivalence between these two sides over what's happened, is there?
So I don't know about that. I mean, I think with peace processes, you will often find you need to talk to groups which have very different sets of values, very different amounts of power. It happened between the UK, of course, and the Republican groups in Northern Ireland. It happened between the Hutus and Tutsis. It happened in South Africa. It can take place. Peoples can move from terrorism to a peace process, as we found in Northern Ireland, as we found, obviously negotiating with some of the early groups arriving in Israel itself, of course. So it can be done. It's very, very hard, but that's why we have diplomats. That's why we have diplomacy. That's why we negotiate. There has to be a path through, but it takes time and patience. George Mitchell said about Northern Ireland that peace is 799 days of failure and 1 day of success. But it starts with recognizing that common humanity which we have. That has to be the starting point, because without that, we'll get nowhere.